Figuring it out, the 14th annual conference in Dallas of the Coalition on Political Assassinations. Started in '94 when we started kicking in, but we had a major national conference in DC, but we also had a small gathering here, continuing the work and also the tradition of Penn Jones to hold a moment of silence on the grassy knoll. And it's been an interesting and bumpy time. It's been, despite how long we are from these assassinations, and this was, of course, many know, an anniversary year, 40 years since Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, 45. Tomorrow will mark the 45th anniversary of John F. Kennedy. But it's been a busy year for COPA. And we had the opportunity, because the Audubon Ballroom has been restored as a historical museum in honor of Malcolm X and his wife, Dr. Betty Shabazz, to co-sponsor a panel on February 17th on the 43rd anniversary of Malcolm's murder, investigating that case, and got coverage on satellite XM radio for that. We did a regional meeting in Memphis, small but quite interesting, interacted with several other organizations that were there, were part of marches, and held our sign up to the King children to release the files. They were standing up on the balcony when their father was killed. And we went to Los Angeles and had a pretty bang-out conference there with a lot of hot new evidence in the Robert Kennedy case. And evidence continues to emerge in these cases. We're doing this today in between. Dr. Cyril Wecht and other leading forensic pathologists held a very interesting conference on all the assassinations called Making Sense of the 60s in Pittsburgh, and had a lot of really good new research that weren't there to be able to get a hold of the DVDs and things that will come out from that, because it was almost all new. And here's one example. Dr. Eric Randich, PhD, forensic materials expert, did a metallurgical assessment of the bullet and lead composition and showed that what they said had to be exclusively a bullet fired from Oswald's gun was not. And just eliminated that by showing that the way they were analyzing the batches. And it did come out, probably, I think we discussed it last November, that the particular overall testing of the matching on bullets that the FBI was using, this included, was faulty, and in fact affected over 200 cases that they're going to have to now revisit, where they came up with positive matches, ballistic matches that weren't really the case. And that started back in the period with, in fact, might have started directly with the John F. Kennedy case and the work that they did there, as if they invented a new method in order to prove that case, which is more likely than not what they did, since every other thing doesn't follow it. But we have been continuing to look into the political assassinations of that whole period, as well as other political assassinations. But it's exciting. If some of you weren't in Los Angeles or haven't heard about the work of Dr. Robert Joling, who, like our first president, Dr. Cyril Wecht, was himself the president of the American Academy of Forensic Science, and Philip von Prague, an audio expert, using a tape that had lain dormant in an archive in California for over 20 years, an actual tape of the assassination sounds and the bullet sounds. We're able to analyze a total of 13 shots, and also to show that 5 of the shots were from one weapon and 8 from another, and their sound signatures distinguished. And this is very similar to what the researchers have said from way back in the 60s, that there was a second gun in the pantry. Sirhan's gun only held 8 shots, so this accounts for 5 more from a different gun, and even identified the gun as the most likely suspect in the case. But they've got hard new evidence, and I did some work to try to get some interest up on the Hill to actually open a congressional investigation in it with Dennis Kucinich, who knows Paul Schrade, one of the witnesses that also spoke there, that was wounded that night in the pantry. So there continue to be new things and new evidence, and it was kind of amusing watching the newscasters now, who, you know, as you know, have almost no historical or political context whatsoever. They're just reading things, you know, and they're not like Sarah McClendon or the Helen Thomas of the past. They're just basically put up in front of a camera with a piece of paper, and the one was trying to explain to the other what these doctors were saying, and they said, well, these doctors have found new evidence that Sirhan couldn't have shot Robert Kennedy in the back because he was always in front of Robert Kennedy, and then they were also showing that there were perhaps 2 guns involved in this, and that there were too many bullets for one gun, and the other woman said, it's very complex. So it's pretty complex there. Figure that kind of stuff out. Simple mathematics. But our conferences this year were called the Assassination of Martin Luther King, Killing the Dream, the Assassination of Robert Kennedy, Killing Hope, and this conference here in Dallas is Assassination of John F. Kennedy, Killing Democracy. And those have been some of our themes for quite some time. I was asked to come to the Pittsburgh conference to talk about what's next, but before I go into a little bit of that, I just wanted to do an overview of what we're doing here tonight and for the next few days. And I had 2 keynoters lined up for tonight, and unfortunately one of the ones that had confirmed for a long time canceled at the last minute. Walt Brown, but did send a statement that he wanted me to read, so I'll do that. And Lyndon Barsten is here busily setting up easels and things, who's done groundbreaking work on the Martin Luther King assassination, has a new book out called Truth at Last, and has been an indefatigable documentarian and researcher on the case for at least a decade, hasn't it been?
About 15 years.
15, okay. Didn't mean to short shrift him. 100 pounds, okay. So he's got amazing new evidence, in part relating to genre. I'll talk to you later. And then if people are night owls and want to stay up, we might be able to, since friend Carl is the projector here, and we have a VHS and a DVD player to play some movies back at the hotel tonight, but not required. Just see if people are interested, we've got the room. Tomorrow we're going to start in at 9 in the morning at the second floor rear at the Hotel Lawrence, where we traditionally meet, and technology willing, we're going to be live streaming Cyril Wecht, President of the organization, for the first hour. But then we have a number of other people speaking tomorrow who are independent researchers and authors. Dick Russell, who has a brand new book out on the trail of the JFK assassins, which collects his materials since he wrote The Man Who Knew Too Much. I told him one time I think it's The Man Who Wrote Too Much, but now Bugliosi's outdone him, so with an even larger doorstop book. And Tom Hartman and Lamar Waldron seem to be, working on multiple volumes that you can use in the same way. But no lack of things to say about these assassinations, but a lot of books out this year. But Dick's going to join us out on the grassy knoll along with some of the others and speak after our moment of silence at 12:30. But from 9 to 12, we'll have different people. Robert Groden was in Pittsburgh and has brand new photographic evidence, including a frame of the Zapruder film where he has actually isolated and blown up one of the bullets hitting the curb, hitting the street, and causing the, and just in that one frame, you can actually see the bullet hitting the street. So it helps identify the timing of the shots and other things. But he has brand new photographic evidence and a whole new book that's not printed yet, but he's finished the book, his photographic evidence, so he's going to be talking to us about that. And Gerald McKnight is scheduled to be here, who is an archivist on with the Weisberg collection at Hood College in Maryland. And we may also get Bar McClellan, at least confirmed, and hasn't unconfirmed from my other emails, so I don't have a phone number for him, so I just sort of rely on his personal saying he wanted to be here and he had some new things he thought he could present. But one of the last times he confirmed, his son Scott got married on November 22nd, and I thought it was a strange day to be married, but I had to attend the wedding, and then Scott made some international and national news after leaving the Bush administration, talking out a little bit about what he was asked to do. That was quite interesting. So hopefully Laura will come. John, just saw John Kellan, and he's going to be presenting tomorrow afternoon. He did Fair Play magazine, and he's written an excellent book about the early critics. And Ed Tatro has new evidence that he wants to present here, so he's going to speak. Ben Rogers is coming up from the Penn Jones Archive and Collection at Baylor University Pogue Library, and people who want to may, on Sunday, if you're still around, after we quit, we may run down to the Pogue Library and take a look at that. And Rex Bradford, who works hard putting all sorts of documents and digitizing them for the Mary Farrell collection, has some brand new materials to present as well that he's been working with and wants to talk about whatever they have. And they've been putting out, if you're not tracking them, they're putting out books now. They've put out the CONTELPRO hearings from back in the 70s that the pundits said that investigation and Watergate and the restrictions that were put on the intelligence agencies is what led to 9/11. I don't happen to think so, but that was the first thing that they blamed 9/11 on was the CONTELPRO overflow. But they have that. Peter Dale Scott's War Conspiracy has been reissued and updated, and so they've got some interesting new books there from that library. And then Mel Hyman is here, who works in school and teaches some of this to students, and we'll talk about his recent work. And we were going to have Chris Pike, but he told me the last minute that he couldn't get down financially. So we don't have a huge crowd, in part because of the economy that we're going into. I've already started writing my Christmas ditty to put on my answering machine, and the first line that I wrote was, "Dead us all for bailout follies." You can do the rest. But it's an interesting time. It's a time of transition, and it's a time that's going to open up some things for us, I think. There's no lack of interest in these assassinations, even up to the present date. So we'll have good speakers all day tomorrow. We'll go from 9 to noon. We'll break. We'll go out in the grassy knoll, do the moment of silence, God willing, in our permit holding, and have some speakers out there, and then come back from 2 to 5 to the Lawrence, and then have dinner. And after dinner, if people are interested, I found out just a few days ago that the Texas Theater, where Oswald was arrested over here in Oak Cliff, is showing the movie JFK, which I'm sure most of us have seen, but there might be an interesting audience watching it that we could talk to afterwards, or perhaps leaflet about COPA, or let them know. So some option to take the shuttle from the Hotel Lawrence. I already talked to the people there about it, over to that event at 7 p.m. if people want to go. We also, if Bob Groden indicated to me he might have some trouble making it by 5 o'clock, and so I could move him to Sunday morning if that's most convenient for him, and we don't want to compete with that showing. There's stuff going on all today, and for the last few days also over at the 6th floor museum. I'm sure none of it are too favorable to us, but they've been having different people talk. They were going to have Dan Rather give his impressions, but that got canceled. I'm not quite sure why. Living Memory, Where Were You? They have some new exhibits up, but they have various public programs going on all weekend over at the 6th floor museum, where they've memorialized and concretized the phony sniper nest, as they've done in Dallas now as well. So it's a mark to false history. And then tomorrow night, again, we can have some movies here at the Lawrence if people want to watch it. I brought a number of DVDs and tapes. On Sunday, we usually start at 9 and go till noon and have wrap up. And as I said, we could go down to the Pogue Library in Waco. And I got invited by a combination of the Dallas Peace Center and the Iranian Peace and Justice Center in Dallas to speak at a public event on Sunday night at 6:30 out on the light rail at the Plano, Texas station, but I just was hearing that there's 2 Plano stations, and I don't know which one it is. And one of them is the George Bush station, so I'm hoping it's not that one, but I'll have to find out which exact stop it is on the light rail. But they wanted me to talk about Dr. King's analysis of militarism and racism and poverty being the 3 main things that need to be addressed, and nonviolent solutions. And I said that I thought a good title for it would be, "What Would Dr. King Do?" Since we have a King imposter recently elected, in my view, it might be important to talk about what Dr. King's real agenda was, and how much of that's being realized by this. So I'll be doing that on Sunday in the evening if people are still around. Registration overall is $50. We have day or night registration for the various days if you're not coming to all of it. We have gotten, some people during the year may have sent us $50, and I promised to send a DVD, but Ralph Cole, our videographer's system broke down, and he hasn't been able to make DVDs for months. And he doesn't have the files digitized, and I tried everything I could think of to get it, but as soon as he says he's back in production, so as soon as he gets them, I've got all the back orders waiting at my house, and I will send them out, and my apologies for the long delay. Usually we don't delay till the next conference to get you a copy, but we do what we can. So I appreciate your support all through the year. I did this preparation for Pittsburgh about where to go from here and what might be happening, and that was prior to the election. But I think the election is making some of this more possible. And of course, our first objective is to release the files, and that's been one of our main goals. And I have some very good news in that regard. Not only have there been ongoing efforts to continue to release JFK records, although not perfect, but those continue to come out in new batches from the National Archives, and by 2017 they're supposed to get a full release, but we're continuing to push them to go further. And Jim Lazar has been working to get hearings that were mandated by the JFK Records Act, an overview hearing that never happened, to see if we could get that to help push it along and get it out of this limbo where they've gone back to FOIA standards in order to release things. There was also a bill passed to improve the FOIA. It doesn't make it perfect, but it's made it, some positive changes. I said to the Sunshine group that meets annually in DC that I thought that reforming the FOIA was a good goal, but it was sort of like plugging holes in a rusty bucket with which you're trying to drain a spring-fed lake. It hasn't gotten out too much and probably won't, so we've been looking at other models. The 9/11 records, which are locked up even tighter than the Warren Commission records, have had some review started in some of the agencies, but it's only been mostly FBI. CIA was not too cooperative. CIA even told the archive that it was too soon to release it. Well, I challenge you to find too soon, and they've got wide enough doors, national security and everything else, but too soon is not a legal standard for whether you release a document or not, but this is what they were saying. But the archives has pushed them, and they have a due date to release the investigative records in redacted or full form on January 2nd, 2009. And that was the date that the 9/11 Commission set up. Unfortunately, you-know-who is still in office. And so it's quite possible that could be reversed at the last minute by some kind of executive order. And I don't know whether it would be challenged by the incoming president. There are some indications that Obama wants to change some of the secrecy mode. There's been some articles in the Post and the New York Times saying that he wants to change the executive order on presidential papers. Bush implemented something that not only his own papers, but the last 2 presidents before him, so Clinton's papers and his father's papers. And if Obama moves in that direction, we may get both Bush and Clinton, both of the Bushes and Clinton's papers, if he actually reverses that with this order. We shall see. But he may do some other things that will cause records to be released, and we have been lobbying him to the extent that we can to consider going back to Clinton's executive order, which Bush 1 blocked, to release all records over 25 years, Like, in other words, if they were older than 25 years, automatic release. And John Dean said that would be over 1 billion records. So that's a lot of material that could get released if they would go back and just adopt that standing executive order that Bush countered and ignored. And to lift the Ashcroft memo and the general hostility to FOIA that was instituted after 9/11. So I work as part of a policy group of different organizations that are trying to get government secrecy ended, Open Government Coalition, they're called, and the COPA and the 9/11 Research Project are part of that. And we continue to move and have conferences and push a little bit in that direction. But the most exciting news to me is that I went recently back to meet with the staff on the Information Policy, Census, and National Archives Subcommittee in the House. And I've been meeting with them regularly because their chair, Lucian Clay, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, was a co-sponsor of Cynthia McKinney's bill, the Martin Luther King Records Act. And I was able just recently to talk to them, and since the election they've decided that the door is open and Representative Clay wants to go ahead with reintroducing the Martin Luther King Records Act and holding committee hearings, and it's his committee that would look at it, in March. And they want to bring me in to consult with the staff about drafting it, and we're also getting back in touch with the King children to see what reservations they had at the end that caused it to slow down. But we had 67 co-sponsors, and we had 2 sponsors in the Senate for a companion bill. It is interesting to me, and I've mentioned this before, that the first person I went to in the Senate was Mr. Obama, and Senator Obama at the time, and he refused to endorse it. And then Kerry endorsed it, and then Hillary endorsed it, I think, because Kerry endorsed it. But Obama wouldn't do it. And never gave me a reason, but so I'm hoping that this will have similar momentum, and especially if they get the kids behind it and they speak out, I think that we may have a chance to get yet another Records Act that's more like the JFK Records Act and start to set this precedent within the coming year. So that's kind of a victory for COPA that we've been working on for a long time.
Thank you.
I know Jim Lazar is continuing to push also for that, and I think there's still a lot of opportunities for public education on these matters, documentaries, and we've had several films come out this year on RFK and other things. Internet and this sort of archiving and digital archiving opens one up, and I think that there's possibilities for some media strategies in the new period to start to bring our points home. And I think there's finally some sort of grudging or minimal acceptance, even though they're always attacking it, within the press to start saying that conspiracies might not be entirely insane to think about, And every once in a while you get somebody saying, well, maybe this is evidence that there was something. And then, they usually come back with a few things, but at least it's not that there's nothing there that says the conspiracy is even within the realm of, how the planet works. So the mood about it, I think, is we're long enough beyond it, but then to that extent, it's also a history that means very little to people in many ways. Whether there was a conspiracy or not, I don't think they're attached to the issue in the way that we work in our lives. And so it's kind of like people go by the Lincoln, Fletcher's Lincoln was shot. Oh, Lincoln was shot. This is the house he was taken to. But it's abstract. I mean, it doesn't really impact on them in any particular way. And it's not a current event. On the other hand, the military-industrial intelligence complex that was in place, that Eisenhower warned about, that Kennedy balked, and that I believe was primarily responsible for killing John Kennedy, is no less military, no less industrial, no less intelligence related, has a huger budget than it did before, is more entrenched, and harder at this point for anybody to really stand up to. And we have a lot of constitutional violations and other things going on since 9/11 that we have to work on reversing, and loss of democracy. But I think that we can start some public campaigns. We've got a little more breathing space to start it and to try to channel some of this. I don't know what happened where you're living, but I live in D.C. and election night was like the whole country had suddenly turned into D.C. because D.C. always votes the right way. And so people were out in the streets, but it was more like a sporting event. And I think at least 50% of it was ding dong, the wicked Bush is gone. But, you know, and everybody was high-fiving, black, white, everybody was in the street, on the cars. And, you know, the police didn't know what to do. They were blocking the streets. Huge droves came down in front of the White House. I'm sure Bush wasn't there that night. Either way, it had come out, he didn't want to be there. And, you know, but it was all dark, but they were chanting, you know, no more Bush. And then there's at least, of course, the symbolic you know, change of putting a person of color in charge in the United States. Probably even more symbolic internationally than here. So there was a lot of enthusiasm and energy, but I think, unfortunately, it will, you know, that bubble will burst or it will dissipate if we don't make the most of it. I continued to work on impeachment issues, and you can impeach people even after they leave office. There are some trial suits being considered now. Some people are clamoring for international courts to take up some of the crimes of the Bush administration after they leave office. And there was a recent indictment announced here of Vice President Dick Cheney and Alberto Gonzales over a scandal that involves, I think it's a youth prison here in Texas. So who knows what the outcome will be, and the judge said he wanted to wait, not bring the charges right away, or you know, see what he's going to do. But you know, at least there's movement in that direction, that these people are not entirely immune from any consequence for all these actions over this time. I don't believe, and never have believed, that you should say why bother, and you know, nothing you can do. And you know, I don't believe in self-defeating prophecies. So I think you have to struggle against this sort of thing, even if you aren't going to win ultimately. And I just think that the mood is changing somewhat. I mean, and to some extent, there's a whole generation that wants to be conspiracy theorists. Even if there's no conspiracy, they'll make one up. So, you know, the mode is there. But I'm just excited about it. And I did. Somebody pointed out in my late night ramblings, and I don't know where this is in my subconscious because I cared absolutely nothing about the person or the case, but I put out an email where I said that one of the Assassination Archive Review Board's members was not Anna Nelson, but Anna Nicole Smith. I don't know where that name came from in the back of my head, because I didn't follow her, I didn't look at her Playboy pictures, you know, but I guess it's stuck in there on some subliminal level. You know, I didn't care whether she was drugged or not drugged or what her baby, who's, you know, and all that news, because I don't even watch TV, but somehow it crept in. So even if you don't watch TV, they must be sending these things by satellite or subliminal notice. But then I got so much flap about it. That I decided I'd say, well, I wanted. The reason I put it in there was to see who would react and to separate the men from the boys. So, but at least Ian Briggs and some others got a kick out of it. But anyway, Anna Nicole Smith's not going to be here this time. It might have been an interesting member of the review board, actually. At least independent. I did invite John Thunheim, and he wasn't able to come at the last minute, the chair, and I wanted him to be here for this 45th anniversary, and he did consider it. And there is a standing invite for a speaker that, if he has time between his other engagements, might come over, and that's DA Craig Watkins, who released some new JFK files this year, who's been taking a progressive stance on crime issues, and who I think we should seriously consider approaching to have a grand jury, open a grand jury in Texas on this case. And you know, I'd like to see some movement in that direction, and Bill Kelly's been continuing to push, but I think he may. So I thought, get him introduced to us if we could, and you know, see if we can ask him about his thinking in that direction. We also petitioned him this year because when the documents came out, the Sixth Floor Museum wanted them, and we said they're properly JFK assassination-related documents. They belong in the National Archive. Texas can have a copy, but you're not even giving them to a public museum, you're giving them to a private museum. And so, you know, and we also know that the odds of them getting a lot of public access were not good, but he actually digitized them, put a lot of them online, so people could look at them. They weren't all that telling, but there was some stuff in them. But just for future, you know, principle, if they did find more, we'd like them to go to the archives. In the last few days, we passed another anniversary, not a happy one, November 18th, 1978, which marked the death in Guyana of 900 people in the Jonestown camp. And I did 3 years of work on that. And I get people now who, when I disagree with them about 9/11 or certain things, they say, oh, you're drinking the government Kool-Aid. And I said, well, the people in Jonestown didn't drink the government Kool-Aid. And Dr. Mutu, the leading pathologist, looked at the bodies. He found evidence of forced injections in the back of the left shoulder blades. Most of the people that died when he was there were 408 women and children and elderly. And the original headline in the New York Times was 400 dead, 700 flee into the woods. And that's exactly what happened. So he counted the 408, despite Army claims later that the Guineas can't count. They can count, and he had to tag everybody, and the Guineas Army actually had to take a bayonet and punch holes in everybody so they wouldn't explode in the heat in the jungle. So they knew how many were there, and it was 408, and it didn't turn into 915 until 5 days later, and then we got more stories about bodies on top of bodies and all sorts of nonsense. Or they didn't go around the pavilion, which is no bigger than this room, half this room in an open-air pavilion for 5 days, and when they went around, lo and behold, they found 500 more bodies. But what was happening was that people were being gathered up in the jungle, captured and killed by British Black Watch and eventually American Green Beret troops. And I've seen interviews of the BBC on some Black Watch troops confessing that they were given orders to shoot anybody they saw. And I've also talked to people who met with Green Berets who talked about the knives, serrated knives they used to kill people there. And the bodies show signs of shots and strangulation. Dr. Mutu testified to the Guineas grand jury, which ruled that all the deaths at Jonestown were murder. And to this day, the most recent AP wire story here, Jones plotted cyanide deaths years before Jonestown. And it says 1/3 were children, that's true. Only 33 survived, that's not true. There were 1,100, 915 dead. And it says that Americans were led to mass murder-suicide by Reverend Jim Jones. Murder-suicide. Well, friends, which is it? I mean, when the body is dead, it's either murder or suicide. It's not, oh, he died of murder-suicide. You know? I mean, but this was a term they used from 78 on, and they're still using this nonsense term of describing it as both as once, because the reality is and I went through also that they didn't drink cyanide or weren't even injected with cyanide, because cyanide has a specific pathology, cholinesterase inhibitor, muscle spasms, back arches, limb spleen spasm, and you get something called rictus, a death grin that widens the mouth and very visible. It's very easy to tell that someone died of cyanide. And none of the bodies in all the hundreds of pictures I saw, aerial and close-up, show any signs of cyanide pathology. None. And the Guineas grand jury were all murder, and they were the ones that weren't shot or strangled over several days were injected with some poison, but it wasn't Kool-Aid laced with cyanide, injected or drunk. And Dr. Joling was sitting there in LA when I went through this in Los Angeles at the COPA meeting, and I looked over to him when I was describing what it does and the cholinesterase reaction, which is the chemical soup from the brain to the muscles. And I said, how am I doing? And he said, yeah. And I found out afterwards he had talked to Dr. Mutu himself and knew that they didn't die of cyanide. But this is a continued lie that all these years we've been told that this was just a cult, and these crazy black people, when a white minister told them, poured cyanide down their babies' mouths and killed themselves. And it was actually a mass mind control operation, and they had to pull the plug because Leo Ryan was going to expose it. And so they killed him, first Congress killed him duty. And his aide, Jackie Spears, knows much of this story, and she just got reelected into the House. She took Tom Lantos' seat, and I was up there early on trying to see if I could talk to her, get into her office. Because she and Joe Holsinger, the aide to Ryan, know this story. They're furious with Mark Lane about it, and we're dragging him down there into it and knowing that it was likely that they'd get killed. And Joe Holsinger was on Larry King 3 years into my work when I was about the only person saying this, and he said, well, my conclusion is that the CIA and military intelligence was involved. This was a mind control operation in a concentration camp, and the people were murdered. They didn't kill themselves. This is Joe Holsinger, the direct aide to Leo Ryan on national television. I about fell out of my chair. I was like, well, somebody inside knows the truth. And, they confirmed him, because they called and said that Leo Ryan was dead, and he said, can you confirm? And they said, yes, this is the embassy, yes, we have had a CIA guy on the scene. And we know at least one person from CIA that was revealed to have been there at the camp, and also where Ryan was killed.
Was this a mind control program when they had the church in California? Because didn't they all come from that church in California?
Yes, the mind control stuff started really in earnest, I think, when they got isolated out in the jungles in Guyana, but the inception of it was a behavior modification program in California in the Reagan administration run by Dr. Stubblebine on federal funds that was to study. Sam Ervin reported some of this in his final report on the government role in individual behavior modification was the title. The targets of government mind control at that point, according to Ervin's studies and the documents, were blacks, women, elderly, and children. Why? Because those are the most potentially violent members of society. But when you think about blacks, elderly, that's the first thing that comes to your mind, are the most violent? Or could it be that they know what they've done to blacks, women, elderly, and children in this society, and they might figure it out and then be violent? But this is how they were tagged, and that was who Jones got. He got children as wards of the court. He got people out of the mental institutions. He got elderly out of homes. He got people in the welfare rolls in San Francisco switched over to him. And he started doing the control by taking all their money, signing everything over to him legally, doing this fake faith healing, punishments. So it was going on, but not at the level of Jonestown. At Jonestown, in the early photos of the dead, every single one has a medical tag around the wrist or around the ankle. And they had enough drugs in Jonestown to drug the entire population of Georgetown, Guyana, which was 100,000 people for a camp of 1,100. And they had all of the drugs that were tested. The Army listed them, and they were the ones that were tested for individual control by MKUltra, were there in mass doses. The footlockers with thousands of doses of Thorazine. And just Hal Pereil was there. They had all sorts of things, and they were testing them with them. They were keeping records. The Army confiscated all the records at the beginning, and they disappeared from the site, and nobody's ever seen the medical records of Jonestown. Dr. Lawrence Schacht was the camp doctor, S-C-H-A-C-H-T, and I believe that he's of the family of Hjalmar Schacht, who was a leading industrialist for Hitler. It's not the only Hitler link. Larry Layton, who was falsely accused of killing Ryan, although he was in a plane and shot another guy, was a leading person there in the organization, one of Jones's top lieutenants. His father, Dr. Layton, West Virginia, coal mining magnate, very rich, headed all chemical biological warfare and weapons research for U.S. Army from 56 to 63 at Dugway Proving Grounds. They were in the line of the nuclear tests. That's why his wife, Lisa Phillips Layton, died of nuclear sickness and cancer from the radiation that she got, and was a big downwind victim. Her father, Hugo Phillips, this is Lisa Phillips Layton, the mother of Larry Layton. Her father, Hugo Phillips, was the personal banker to Adolf Hitler. And there are other ties to military intelligence on the top people around Jones. They're not from nowhere. Terry Buford, who set up most of his accounts, and who lived with Mark Lane and got Grace Walden Stevens, and the two of them, the witness in the Martin Luther King assassination, who said it wasn't James Earl Ray in the room. They tried to get a passport of a woman that had been strangely killed in Ukiah, Maxine Swaney, up to the United States from Jonestown. They wrote to Jones, and these letters were found down there, so that they could get a passport to get Maxine Swaney down there at the point she was to be a witness before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They were trying to transfer her down to the death camp. And so, they had this original plan with Stubblebine, and he brought these two doctors in, Marks and Sweet from Boston, who were doing experimentation on brain implantation. If you've ever seen the novel Terminal Man, that's about a real story of a Vietnam veteran who became more violent when he was implanted by these doctors and eventually locked up. But he got somebody to believe that he wasn't crazy and do an X-ray on his skull, and they found the implanted device. He had gone in because the war had made him more violent, and then they made him worse. And they had gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in naval intelligence contracts to study the idea that some blacks riot and others don't, so the ones that riot must have something chemically or otherwise wrong with their brains. and we can go in and cut that out or find out what it is. And they actually got funded. I mean, it's not, this kind of stupidity can be thought, but this is getting hundreds of millions of dollars to be seriously studied by naval intelligence. So Stubblebine invited them there, and they were going to open up a center for government mind control in California. The UCLA students found out about it and exposed it, and it was right then that they dropped that plan. It was going to be at this abandoned Nike missile base, and all of a sudden everybody went down to Guyana. They went down on buses. They were flown down on Pan Am planes to Port Khatuna Airport, and I talked to an air traffic controller who was there when they arrived, who told me that every adult black coming off of that plane was bound and gagged. And that I talked to people who lived 5 miles away from Jonestown who told me they didn't know there were any blacks at Jonestown. The population was 85% black, it was 90% women, it was a third children, it was elderly, and these people were defenseless. They had families that were indigent, and they were brought into the church and then forced to go down to Guyana. And once they were isolated out there in the jungle, what they wanted from them was a mind-controlled slave labor camp, because the Orinoco River Valley, and especially the Matthews Ridge area, is one of the most mineral-rich areas in the world. And manganese and copper and uranium and bauxite. All of the infrastructure of Jonestown, all of the docks and the airport were built by Union Carbide in the 50s when there were bauxite mining and were still in place. And they had tried to get populations back into the jungle where nobody wants to go. They all live out on the shore since 1909. Two families, Noonan and LeCoux. And the LeCoux family descendant was a lawyer in Guyana, a leading lawyer. He was the lawyer for Jim Jones. They made the deal with Forbes Burnham, who had been put in place by the CIA, who got rid of Chetty Jagan, the socialist leader, and overthrew him. And Burnham was trying to move people back there. There were plans to move blacks from the UK and repatriate them and put them out in the jungles in Guyana. I even found record that Otto Albrecht von Bolschwing and his underling, Adolf Eichmann. So when Eichmann says I was only following orders, he was following the orders of Otto Albrecht von Bolschwing, who did not go to prison or face any charges after the war. He came here. He did quite well with a computer company that Oliver North eventually bought, and his translator from Austria, Helena von Dahm, became Ronald Reagan's personal secretary and moved up into the White House. And the two of them in 1936 decided that the next to final solution would be to move the Jews someplace else, and so they took 50 Jewish families and put them at Matthews Ridge, the site of Jonestown. Even after Jonestown, they brought Hmong and Laotian people that had worked for the CIA and tried to transplant them there, and it didn't work out. And there's a new group coming in within the last year, and I can't find out very much about it, but there was a brief article in the New York Times saying that they're seeing more activity. And Matthews Ridge was also the site of the 5 richest gold mines, the 5-star mines in Guinea's history. And it's right there. And Charles Gary, the lawyer for the Black Panthers, told Jim Jones, "You're sitting on a gold mine." And that's quoted in one of the articles, and he literally was. So this evidence that Jones spotted cyanide deaths years before Jonestown, do you know what it is? It's that he ordered massive amounts of cyanide. How did he order them? Under a jeweler's license. What did he order them for? Well, it must have been to kill all those people, but they do admit in the article that cyanide is a chemical that's very good for cleaning gold. And so he was, and they said, but he wasn't making any jewelry there. And gold mines are known to be cyanide poisoned in the lands around them because whether they pan for gold or look for it, they clean it with cyanide. So the fact that he was ordering a lot of cyanide doesn't mean that that's what killed these people. And the pathology doesn't show it. But the lie continues. This is from CNN and their special just recently. But that's, he ordered all that cyanide. That must have been what it was about. But it was about what was back there, and that they wanted to put slave labor back in there and make it work. But this particular operation, they had to pull the plug, and it killed 900 people. And my article's still up online, Black Hole of Guyana, the untold story of the Jonestown Massacre. So next time somebody says you're drinking your government Kool-Aid, you can explain to them that you're not, and neither did they. Another thing that may happen is that there's word that a lot of government whistleblowers have been sitting on things until Bush goes out of office. And a lot of people might start singing once we pass January 21st. On the other hand, Joe Biden, Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Even Obama himself have been saying with some great specificity, even a date from Powell, January 21st, that Obama, mark my words, Biden says, Obama will be tested as soon as he gets into office with some kind of an incident. So, and even giving it a date. So something may be coming just the other side of this, that whatever hopes Obama has for change, however real they are, or the rest of us, another incident may intervene, which puts the national security state back into power. But it's very important to me that people at that level have been saying this and saying it with such insistence and specificity, so that there's something to watch for. And there are new books. There's Dick Russell's book. There's a new book on Martin Luther King from Lamar Waldron and Tom Hartman. There was a nice book about Bobby's, the last campaign, about Bobby Kennedy. There's the Open and Shut Case by Joling von Prague. There's this book, The Irregulars, which I find important because it's about the specific military British intelligence team, including Ian Fleming, Ernst Cuneo, and others that came in to get America into World War II. And these are people that figure later into the Kennedy assassination. So it's a piece telling you their story. And there's, Bugliosi's book was boiled down into a small version. I think it's called November 22nd or 4 Days in November, something like that. Because, of course, nobody's going to read the thousands and thousands of pages that he put out. Cyril might, if he comes through tomorrow, might talk a little bit about it, but there have been some developments in the trial against him. The original over 80 federal charges were initially reduced to 42. They've now been reduced to 14. A mediator was brought in. The jury locked, even without Cyril making any testimony, just based on the prosecution's, what the prosecution said and what their attorney asked. They didn't even bring up a case, and the jury's still locked. The charges are so weak. The 14 charges that remain are not related to corruption charges, which means that they aren't under the jurisdiction of the federal statute any longer, which is why they went after him. And a new judge is going to be appointed, and there's at least some murmurings just in the last few weeks, and Ed Tatro keeps track of this and sends it out, that they may actually drop the charges at this point and not go forward with them.
Can I interrupt you at that point?
Sure, Ed.
I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9. I'll be down there.
All right.
And do we have a CD player for, I got two possibilities.
We have DVD and CD and other, we can play
so
CD on the...
I'll see you tomorrow morning.
We're going to be try to stream Cyril in right at 9 o'clock, but if you can talk at the end of that.
I gotta walk from there to there, so.
Gotcha.
I'll try to leave a little early, but, I don't know, I'm sure you're not even sure how many the speakers are actually gonna show. I know Bar's not coming, I don't know if he contacted you.
Who? Bar?
He's not coming.
He did not.
Yeah, I talked to him yesterday.
Yeah, well, we'll have enough room for you, no question. I just might not be the first thing as long.
No, that's okay, no problem. I just wanted to let you know that, I'll be there.
Okay, thank you, Ed. We look forward to it. My friend Susan McLucas came. This is her first time at COPA, and she wrote a nice letter. She wrote me before it to try to find out about it, but they had something in the news up there about an editorial by Priscilla Johnson Mcmillin, her usual nonsense. And so Susan sent in a letter. Did they eventually print it or didn't? But she sent a letter to the editors about Priscilla's background and her, compliance with the CIA and other things. So there's still opportunities to try to counter these liars, but it's harder to, outside the blogs, to get printed. And I don't know, there's new witness books. I'm sure you follow them probably as much as I do, but we will have a resource room tomorrow, and with books and tapes and things. Gerald Blow will be here from Last Hurrah, and they'll be in the room across from where we meet through the rest of the weekend. Somebody also, I think it was Ed Sherman, sent me 2 pictures. This one's probably recognizable to you as the Oswald and the Marines in 1958, and then he sent this picture of an older man whose name is Don Norton. And there are some, at least to me, I'm not an expert, but there are some facial similarities between these two. But this sort of more round-faced Oswald than the traditional one that you see, the one that you see in Dallas, I think is the Oswald that survived. And Russell and I met a guy using the name Don Norton in the Watergate period, who we suspected was the real Oswald, Marguerite's son. And Marguerite told Mae Russell that her son did not die in the basement of the Dallas jail. And I think it would have been in her interest not to spread that around to keep him alive. But this guy ran out to us out of the dark, and he said, "Mae, don't you know who I am?" And she peered at him under the light, and she said, "You look like Leroy Oswald." And he looked down and said, "A lot of people tell me that." And he said, "I'm Don Norton." She said, "Oh, Don Norton lives in Akron." Said he might come down. This is John Judge. She said, "Don Norton's the only person in the country who sends me money to do my research." He looked at his feet again, and he said, "That's my conscience money." And I said, inside of my head, "Who the hell is this?" So I said, "Hey, come on down the house and sit down with Mae and, have a cup of coffee and blah, blah, blah." So we got her to come down, but he didn't ask her any questions. He began to recite verbatim what Oswald had said to Bringuier in the debate in New Orleans, where he talks about being a Marxist. I went into all this, but he was quoting it verbatim. And I still didn't know what was going on. I tried to get him. I said, "I can send you my research." He said, "General delivery, Akron, Ohio, Donald P. Norton." But the next day, Mae said to me, "Didn't you think that was Oswald?" And I said, "Well, Oswald's dead, isn't he, Mae?" And she said, "No, his mother told me it's not." And she said he looked just like him, and she said, "I'm going to go home and check his signatures," because she had collected every signature on everything that Oswald had written. And there's two distinct signatures going on there. She found that all of Norton's letters were unsigned. He would always type his name. And then he told her that he was joining Lyndon LaRouche's organization, and then he disappeared. But some of the researchers feel they found him, and that this guy who lives down in Florida might be the original Oswald. I also, in the Bermudas...
Well, he's buried in his grave here in Dallas.
Pardon?
They dug his grave up.
They did dig a grave up. They found the grave, which it was a very heavy grave, like almost cement grave, like with all the steel, and had been broken open. The body inside the head was detached, and then the Baylor, which is the scene of other things to do with Kennedy assassination, they ruled that it was indeed Oswald by checking his dental records. But when I went over at dinner, is that Hugo Blatschke, who was the personal dentist for Adolf Hitler, came to the United States. He's in Cornelius Rhine's longest day. He went to dental school at the University of Pennsylvania. His roommate became the leading forensic dental pathologist in the United States. And he that person wrote an article in Vermont Magazine, of all places, where I found it. He had spent 40 years trying to verify what Hugo Blatschke had told him and felt that he had. And Blatschke told him that Hitler and Eva Braun did not die in the bunker and that the bodies were replaced. And the method, which is very simple if you think about it, was not to fake the evidence, but merely to replace it. So that the body that they replaced Hitler with in the bunker, the dental records for that body were also placed in the file that said Hitler when the British intelligence would find it. And it's certainly not beyond their capacity to have done the same thing for whatever file they were looking at that said this is Oswald's teeth, to have had the teeth for the right Oswald or whoever it was that they killed there.
Wasn't there an absence of a craniotomy on the skull in the grave?
Yes,
and
there were other
Oswald
discrepancies.
and the Warren Oswald had a craniotomy.
There were other discrepancies, and John Armstrong and early on Richard Popkin did a lot about two Oswalds. When I was in the Bahamas for the meeting with Cuban intelligence and the JFK researchers, I had dinner with the head of Cuban intelligence, and he told me that when he was being trained by the KGB in the late 60s in Moscow, that there was a living Oswald there at that point, that his handler told him that Oswald was still in the Soviet Union. So that may be the Oswald that came back later and that we saw in the 70s. But I'm pretty sure that we saw one of them. And my housemates discounted it and said, "Oh, what are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, you don't look at enough pictures of Oswald, but this guy really did look like him." And we went to see the next month Executive Action came out, and they flashed that photo and the passport photo of the round-faced Oswald, and Kathy sat next to me, grabbed my arm and said, "Oh my God, it's him." And Liz, sitting behind, said, "Oh shit, it's him." So they, who had seen him in the flesh, also recognized the connection. So I think we may have met an Oswald. Strange thing to say, but
Where is Donald P. Norton now?
in Florida, is my understanding. And I think if you talk to Ed Sherman or the others, they
What's he doing in
track it.
Florida? Is he retired or what?
He's bait and fish shop. But that's what he always did.
Oh, yeah.
Or bait and switch, one or the other. Let me just talk about one other place that I think will go. I'll do Will's statement and I get on to Lyndon because he's got a lot of good information. I just got a $10,000 grant from a private foundation to try to look into getting additional funding to my idea that I've been nursing over several years to have a museum of hidden history in Washington, D.C. A place where we can present real evidence about this and many other aspects of hidden history and new films, new books. It's a media center. It's a place where we get tens of millions of tourists. If people will go to where Lincoln was killed, I think they'll come to find out about the other assassinations, and we can counter the spy museum. There's some chance for federal and D.C. funding as well for any new museum. There's some leads. We also have several new sponsors. So at this point we have Cynthia McKinney, former Representative Cynthia McKinney is a sponsor. Phil Donahue is a sponsor, a filmmaker now, but a TV celebrity. We have Peter Del Scott, Michael Parenti, and I just got Howard Zinn. So building on that, but if you know people that you think would be good sponsors for it, I think we can start to get it some credibility through those things and get some
Who
funding.
gave you the money? What was the outfit?
I'm a private foundation, someone that I know that, he's a family foundation, and he gets to chip in his part of it to what he wants, so. But we're glad to get it.
I know the government won't be giving you things, too many things from the archive. What exactly are you going to put in this museum that will make it so valuable, that will give insight that you don't get from reading and all that?
Well, I wanted to have an attached research center like the Holocaust Museum and other museums, some other museums do, where we can start to collect not only the thousands of books and files that I have, but also possibly restore May Brussels collection, and instead of going to Stanford, bring it there, have other people get on. I'm trying to negotiate as best I can with Jim Lazar, who seems favorable to the idea, and I don't see a reason to do separate museums, to have the AARC files and books be part of that research center. But I think we at this point have a lot of photographic and documentary evidence that could be displayed like it is at the Holocaust Museum. I think we have enough people to keep it going as a center where we have constant presentations by new authors or show new films or just get the interest up. But I think we've got enough documentation. I mean, we don't have everything we'd like, but also in conjunction with this change in the secrecy, we may begin to get more and to present things.
My wife would like to be able to get the car into the garage.
A notable goal.
There are several file cabinets on the king case that you're welcome to.
Well, that's very generous of you. We'd be glad to
Good
have it.
idea, I like to too.
But I think, unfortunately, this kind of collection, and there are many of them, are going to be lost to history. And just filing them someplace in a storage bin, it keeps them, but it doesn't get anybody to them. And so I think this is an opportunity, hopefully, and maybe we could take some of the methods that Rex has been using and start to digitize it, because the Mary Farrell collection is growing and searchable, and I think we can try to combine efforts. And I don't know, I'm getting a little long in the tooth and a little tired. I think sometimes should I do COPA every year, because we have diminished returns, but certainly we need, I think, to start thinking now about the 50th. It's going to be big, it's going to be a lot of media around it, and pulling as many of the different groups together like the Pittsburgh group, and not having to have disparate conferences all over the place. And Dallas seems to be the place to do it, the logical place to do it, but I think we should start thinking that far out at least. And I think we have some potentials with the other assassinations as well.
You talk about the streaming of Dr. Wecht tomorrow. I spent several days in Pittsburgh earlier this year and happened to hear his interviews on KDKA, which turns out is streamed all the time. So you can sit there with your computer and listen to KDKA. It's like it's a local station. Maybe catch some of the interviews with Dr. Wecht.
Well, if nothing else works. Maybe that's an option. If anybody does have a lot of technical knowledge about that, our tech people could use help and expertise as well. But we've been trying for the last 4 conferences to to stream, and we always, whether it's the hotel doesn't have the computer connection or the camera doesn't link to the software, or there's been a glitch after glitch, but we're trying to solve it as hard as we can, so, on limited budget. And this is from Walt Brown, then. To John Judge and all my colleagues and friends at COPA in Dallas on this, the 45th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. And I can't quite do his New Jersey accent, so you'll have to forgive me. Please know that it is not easy for me not to be with you this evening, but at least part of the reason is JFK related, so that lessens my loss, at least in part. 18 months ago, when I received a publisher's copy of Mr. Bugliosi's children's book, which apparently is wholly dismissive of the combined several thousand years of research by hundreds of people, I issued a challenge to the author. If you want any reader to believe your dribble, then as an educated man, I challenge you to learn Russian on your own in 1 year. I will take the challenge I'm issuing to you, and I propose that we meet in July 2009 on Uspenskaya Street in Sevastopol to chat. If you can do that, sir, I might permit a shred of credibility to your work. Absent that, it's nothing but an exaggerated Warren report, which is like changing a small fender bender into a train wreck. Parenthetically, if you don't know it, Walt recently connected with a woman in Russia and fell in love and has married her, and she's over here in the U.S. with him. And one of the comments he made to me on the phone when he was telling me he couldn't come was that there's absolutely no way that Oswald had spoken in Russian for all that time because he didn't carry any of the accent. And Walt, if you call him, is barely now able to get out of the accent for the first 10 or 15 minutes of any conversation. He's still doing the Russian, so yet another indication that there was, somebody else talking to someone over there. Mr. Bugliosi never responded to my challenge, although he has kept in touch with me. For my part, I decided that inasmuch as I had about as much leisure time as Marina Lee Oswald in which to teach myself Russian, I would take my own challenge. And toward that end, I got involved in some websites emanating from the Russian Federation. As it happens, the ones I chose at random, not Random House, mind you, all involved identical demographics, young, unmarried women. I thought this would parallel Oswald as he was young and unmarried when he allegedly taught himself Russian. Out of that correspondence grew a truly wonderful friendship with an economist from Moscow, and we were married on September the 19th of this year, just over 2 months ago. I continue to learn the Russian language, Russian customs, and if the stories about Marina Oswald's laziness are accurate, clearly she and Elena, pronounced Yelena, were clearly separated at birth, as Lena has worked night and day in our home to allow me to continue my JFK work. She knows very little about the event, but has been a constant source of encouragement. She has also been my conscience and prodded and encouraged me toward the dental work I've been avoiding for far too long, and as a result, I've had 2 oral surgery procedures in the last 4 weeks, and about all I can say about such procedures is that they are even less fun than having a 3-way conference call with Hugh Ainsworth and Jim Lavelle. But please know that I am here with you in spirit, and I have tried assiduously to answer all of your emails. John will give you the address later if you don't have it, and I want very much to believe that the emails read much better than I am able to speak just now. If I have not answered all your emails as quickly as you might like, please understand that they come in third behind my JFK work and my ongoing honeymoon, and not necessarily in that order. Before I get to my intended message for this dissertation, I'd like to share some wonderful publishing news with you. I've learned that President Bush's autobiography will be published in late April, and it is believed that the necessary crayons to color it in will be included in the retail price. Secondly, I have followed quite closely the research community's thoughts on the Bugliosi JFK book from 2007, and I have not seen anything good in print about it. While I disagree with much of its contents, I feel constrained to tell you that there is at least 1 and possibly 2 outstanding commas on page 826. And I think they deserve our continued attention. Beyond that, I agree with the research community's opinion that the book would have been a better use of trees if it had been made into what we tactfully refer to as bathroom tissue. Speaking more seriously, it has been 45 years since that horrible day in Dallas. It is almost inconceivable that such time has passed, just as it is that almost impossible to believe that in a few weeks I'll be 14 years older than the President of the United States. But there it is. Many of the key players from 1963 are gone from the passing parade. Many of the early researchers, as so beautifully cataloged in John Kellen's recent book, have also left us or long ago abandoned their efforts out of fear or frustration or both. Many of those of us who once haunted these conference halls are also gone. Although I want very much to believe that as long as I keep the JFK Deep Politics Quarterly alive, I keep their spirit alive. There was an investigation into President Kennedy's murder in 1963, 1964, and we know where that went. 15 years later, a second inquiry found probable conspiracy, yet the American public, while not believing the first investigation, is almost illiterate with regards to the second. Then another 15 years passed, and yet another look-see was available through the veil of secrecy. So we've had the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the Review Board. Now, it's been almost 15 years since the Review Board began their labors, but there is no new every 15 years investigation in the works. And there never will be another investigation. We can militate all we want for the truth, but the only guaranteed truth is that the government does not want us to have it, and they are not going to do anything to give it to us. If you have doubts, recall that the Review Board created to declassify all related materials, kept materials under seal until 2017, still 9 years off. And between the Review Board going out of business and today, additional materials have been classified that were never seen by the Review Board. The bottom line is that such truth as we will ever know must come from within our own ranks, and I can live with that idea and live with it very well, as there are some very capable people still very hard at work to find such truth as is possible to discover. The challenge then is to separate those good folks from the crackpots trying to sell us just about anything between the front and back covers of a book for the sake of a quick buck. Not only do they obfuscate the truth, but they rob the honest researchers of their dignity, or they become lumped in with the charlatans. There is an old saying that when the piano needs to be moved, there will always be a majority of people willing to help move the bench. And that is the position we find ourselves in today. The piano hasn't yet been moved, but it can be moved if everyone makes every imaginable effort to seek the truth, to ferret out documents still available, to expose charlatans for what they are. I've been blessed to have the time and energy to dig since the 1960s, and I will continue to do so for as long as I'm able. Before I put my name on another book, however, I feel obligated to go back and review my old books, as recent digging has caused me to rethink some past conclusions. That is a debt owed to anyone in this room and to anyone still interested in what really happened a few blocks from here in 1963. And I will pay that debt in full, I assure you. Until I do so, I want to share with you that what I've been doing since the early autumn of 2005. And that is the master analytical chronology of the Kennedy assassination. I concluded the first printing, if you will, in March of this year when it reached 5,789 pages, which amount to perhaps 50% data and 50% analysis. Those of you that have accused me of either sarcasm or wit may find a measure of both as well. After a trip to Moscow this year, I went back to work on the chronology, and I'll have the first update completed for this conference a year from now, and I suspect it will entail about 7,500 pages. What is most significant for me in this project, aside from leaving future generations a thoroughly footnoted place to begin, is the ability to see what the event looks like when all the ducks are lined up. I can assure you the view from there is quite different from the view in any other work you may have read. It's in the original first printing. It began in 1850 with the establishment of Gawler's Funeral Home. It was that establishment that was dragooned into Bethesda Hospital to prepare the President of the United States for burial in a blood-splattered morgue and not in a proper funeral home. That singular fact tells us much about JFK's standing within the government at that point in time. For the ever curious, it is also noted that Gawler's, at the time of their labors at Bethesda, had never prepared any African American remains for burial. And it is an irony that such an establishment would most likely never have been chosen by President Kennedy for that reason. a classic case of racial non-cleansing, if you will. The first update or second printing of the chronology now goes back to 1823, the birth of Patrick Kennedy, the first of the future clan to come to America. Patrick would marry and leave behind offspring that would succeed in the liquor business, just as his grandson, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., would succeed in the liquor business. But then again, with Ted Kennedy alive, what liquor business could possibly fail? Again, for the ever-curious, it is noted that the original Kennedy died in 1858, on November 22nd in 1858. And he certainly was not the last Kennedy to die far too young on November 22nd. And so I put these thoughts on paper to share with you in the collegial atmosphere we have shared so many times. My temporary health setback has not stopped my ongoing work, and I hope to complete the chronology for November 22nd, 2013, the next occasion on which the infamous date falls on a Friday. Until then, I ask all of you to continue to contribute your thoughts, ideas, questions, and your time to the search for truth. If I can help, please contact me at kiasjfk@aol.com. I'll certainly give you the time I'm able to spare from Mr. Kennedy, as Sissy Spacek called him in Oliver Stone's movie. I don't have a name for the man. He was the president, he was John F. Kennedy, he was JFK. More than that, however, he was the young hope of a young generation of which I was a part, and which lost its way as a shattered motorcade and sped a shattered president to a rendezvous with the last rites of his church. He was thereafter buried on government property to guarantee that no exhumation would ever be possible. President Taft is also at the Arlington, the big grave that you can't miss, and they're the only two presidents whose graves are guarded by men and women with guns. That too should tell us something. It is thus imperative that we never allow the charlatans to bury his memory or demean his execution by piling it on the lone nut who planned a meticulous escape on a city bus headed back to the scene of the crime. To do that would be more indecent than the deeds ascribed to the lone nut. Let us continue to work together for as long as it takes. I'll do my part as I have. Please continue to work with me or join me, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Well, Brown. Bill Turner also couldn't come, and I have some presentations from him that he wanted to give to Pittsburgh but couldn't. And Peter Del Scott also provided us a copy of his Pittsburgh presentation, which makes links between JFK and 9/11 and other things, and that's up on the website as well at COPA. So with that, I want to introduce a friend and fellow researcher and independent investigator who's unearthed things in the Martin Luther King case that the rest of us have missed all these years, and things that are important about it, and has actually been able to dig up completely new material, as evidenced by his book, Truth at Last. So this is Lyndon Barsten. He's presented at COPA before, but he has documents to show you, and part of a film of some talk that John Ray, James Ray's brother, did.
There was a question.
Oh, someone had a question.
Oh, well, from earlier on, I was going to ask, I can't quite see what this button is that you're wearing.
Oh,
I'm gonna ask you about
someone who came, one of the regulars gave me it. It is, the button with the circle and the cross, meaning no, and this is a picture of Alan Dulles.
Oh.
I guess I'm one of the professors who read the Warren report.
That's right. I don't know if he ever read it. He just told him what I had to say.
I'll move we should watch the video, and then I'll move the documents forward. Please, thank you so very much for having me. Please, let's, if tonight can be informal, if you have a question, please ask a question. It's nice to see so many familiar faces.
Are you afraid of tea?
Pardon?
Is that you're afraid of tea?
Am I afraid of?
The friend of tea.
Oh, friend of teas, yes. Yes. If we could maybe play the video. I've been interested in this case since speaking to Reverend Hosea Williams some years ago. And a number of things about the case never made sense to me. And this is after James Earl died. His brother attempted to tell a story, a much deeper story about his brother's life. And it explained a lot. Things didn't make sense to me. Like, I knew James Earl Ray, and I just couldn't get it. I'll give you an example. Why he was given this name, Eric S. Galt, to use as an alias after he escaped from prison in April of '67, and it's a name with a security clearance attached to it. And he never would admit who gave him that name. As a matter of fact, Wayne Chastain, who was his local Memphis attorney, when Wayne met James for the first time, he said, "Who gave you the Galt name, James?" And James always came up with different stories, perhaps deliberately different stories. And the truth is that James Earl Ray was knowingly an intelligence operative, and that he knew that the Galt name was attached to U.S. intelligence, and that's why he never admitted it. I'm going to speak tonight about the behavior modification, the behavior modification of James Earl Ray, which is kind of a subtext of my book, Truth at Last, written really with John Larry Ray, James Earl's brother. And I think that this is important because if you look at government operations over the years, if you look at Jonestown, if you look at John Hinckley, the shooting of Reagan, the shooting of Wallace, the shooting of Alberta King, Dr. King's mother, the John Muhammad, the DC supposed DC sniper, and the shooting of Lyndon Franklin, there is this important thread that appears to run through all of these cases. And this video, I believe, is John, before I met him, describing seemingly a behavior modification program without knowing it. So you could watch that.
You need lights down.
Greetings. I'm
Sorry,
a
it's
weather
not really
James
queued
Earl
up,
Ray.
so I'll cut it early though.
I would like to make it true information about who actually killed King. But Martin Luther King, 1974, my brother James Earl Ray gave me a confession in the Shelby County Jail, Memphis, Tennessee. It was salvation down there. He told me about Raul was the trigger man. Raul was a federal agent or ex-federal agent. Before I give you the confession, I'm going to kind of mix the confession in with the statement I'm going to give you here. I want to go back to the kind of beginning, like roots, so it'll be more understandable. The Rays, on my father's side of the family, the Rays and the Matthews, they were Irish immigrants. They moved into the Mississippi Valley in Illinois, on the Mississippi River in Quincy, Illinois. On the mother's side of the family, there was Irish immigrants too. They moved into Mississippi Valley down the river about 120 miles in Alton, Illinois. On the mother's side of the family, named the Maras and the Fitzsimmons. The Fitzsimmons had a coal mine, and their own coal mine, and the mine in Dakota where they made their living. And the Mayors made, and my grandfather Mayor, he was a grass grower, and it's right around the United States. That's his occupation. And my father's occupation, their grandparents, my grandparents, James Ray, and Louise Ray, my grandmother. Well, when they moved into Mississippi Valley, they settled in Quincy, Illinois, and he owned a hack station, the only hack station in Quincy yet. It was like a stagecoach hack, for someone who don't know what a hack is. It's like a stagecoach, driven by horses, and it's a front end to a taxi cab. And well, he had 3 children, my grandfather and his wife. My father George, and his other son was my uncle Earl, and his daughter Mabel, and my aunt Mabel. And in during the probation, my grandfather James Ray started organized crime in Quincy, and made so much money, and that money sitting over the house in fruit jars, and his wife took a vacation over the United States, and he needed some help, but there was so much money in it. He couldn't call on my dad because he's a fixing justice in the Iowa State Penitentiary. He's kicked back in 1922. In fact, he became a fixture. Well, he passed away 60-some years later. He had exceeded the guy less than a book again, a record being on skate by 20, 30 years. And my uncle, he couldn't get help from his other son, my uncle Earl, because he's serving time in Southern Iowa Penitentiary, shooting a guy arm off. And so he turned to his daughter, Mabel, husband, his son-in-law, Frank Fuller, and brought him in. And make so much money. In fact, is one time my grandfather, he didn't know how to gamble to begin with, and he also had a big mouth. He told everything he knew. No business when I type of business. And one night in a card game, he lost 2 hours in a tavern, and so finally the Frank Fuller, he bought in the Moncton Brothers, his son-in-law, Frank Fuller. And the Moncton Brothers, and pretty soon they saw how much money was, they got hooked up organized crime in Chicago, and the next thing you know, I moved my grandfather James Ray out on a pasture, so to speak. And then the Moncton Brothers expand the organized crime from bootlegging to gambling to prostitution, pinballs, and everything you think of, gambling equipment. And they also move into Terre Haute, Indiana, and KO, Illinois, and Campbell, expand out of Quincy. But Quincy was the headquarters for the Moncton Brothers. And they in turn they brought in Ted Crowley. He's our jewelry office stuff went on around that. He was behind that, and he came in with prostitution. And they had on a payroll Johnny Sheriff, he's a contract killer. If you came into Quincy, tried to take over, some people tried to, and went to the Mississippi River. Johnny Sheriff put them down the Mississippi River. And they own all the law in Quincy, and sheriff office paid up and stuff like that. And well, you had more or less have to own that type of deal, or you couldn't operate. So anyway, after moving my grandfather out, his daughter Mabel married to Frank Fuller, became like a bag woman, a carrier, a bag woman, we want to call it, and she transferred money to Tampa Bay, New York City, and Chicago, and different places. And when she goes on to Chicago, she would take my brother, James L.A., along with her, and all the mafia people, he was introduced in the early life. He's introduced to all the mafia people in
So
Chicago.
James Earl Ray was known by the mob.
On one
just like
occasion, she
Oswald.
said, they took to a cave, and her and James Earl Ray, some cave have full of swap machines, and the swap machines full of coins, and they told Aunt Mabel and James Earl they could have all the coins. They just wanted a machine, so they spent all day sacking up this coin in the gunny sack, and had a lot of money, and big score, I guess, and she assumed it was stolen, and they just didn't want to get rid of it, get the coins out or something about it, and so when James Earl Ray came, I guess he's down back then was down 12, 13, 14, but when he became 16, he moved down the river to Arnold with his other grandparents, Mom Mary, and my grandmother, and she had 2 kids, and my mother used to stay on her, and the son William Mary. Well, he moved down the river. He went to work in the International Shoe Company when he was 16 years old. Well, he worked into about the end of World War II. It came to close, and the shoe factory shut down, and so he decided in 1946. He was 18 years old. He decided to join the United States military. Well, our family was against this stuff. We don't believe in going to wars with anybody, and I won't go into details there, but he was a black sheep on that, and there's a lot of people in our family that like that at all. And he later said in the South, James Earl said that when he joined the army, put him on the road to jail. And in fact, he spent most of his life after that in jail, which is true about that. And when he joined the army, he didn't smoke or drink, and he had a lot of money because he worked double time and overtime from that shoe factory. He had $7,000-8,000 counting war bonds and stuff accumulated within about 2 years, which is big money. He didn't, like I say, he didn't smoke or drink, and he drove his whole 33 Ford up down the, he was out there when he was off day with me and Brother Jerry, and we just wildcat around there. So he joined the army, and he wanted to go to Ireland where his ancestors were at. So, but he couldn't pick his company. He had the choice of a continent. So he picked Europe, hoping to go to Ireland, but it shipped to Germany. And he got to Germany, and in order to move up in there, you have to join, but the only way you move up is during peacetime, join some type of law and order type of groups. So he joined the CIA and the Army Intelligence, different groups, and he also became a military policeman. And he spent his time in Europe, roaming around, bringing back AWOS soldiers back to the base. And,
This is the
and on behalf of the Army Intelligence, the CIA even become involved in several shootings. And on one shooting, a Negro soldier, there was a couple of people was involved too. Anyway, this Negro soldier got shot named Washington from the state of Tennessee. A guy named Walker somehow was involved. Both of them from Tennessee, Walker and Washington. And Walker was a white guy. Anyways, he didn't get shot, but this Negro soldier got shot, paralyzed. Wound up in the hospital in Tennessee, a veteran hospital in Nashville. Anyway, so when they had a trial over, Washington said, prior to him being shot by my brother, he didn't know how to halt. And that's, supposed to how to halt 3 times, I think. And so he said he did how to halt. So they always take a military policeman when you right or wrong. So they kicked Washington out of the army, but after he served his 3 years, my brother, somebody high up double crossed and put a general discharge on him. And before I leave the army, one more thing, when he joined the CIA, he was a teenage soldier at the time, young. They gave him part of his code number. They gave him a code number. It was connected with his army serial number. He was 16, and it was later changed to 14 or vice versa. That's part of his army serial number. And he said once you join the CIA, or like you join the mafia, once you join yours, you're always a CIA agent, regardless of whether you're still in it or not. And that's a mafia principle. He's right about that. That's a mafia principle too. And maybe the CIA is just a big mafia, a world mafia, where the other type of mafia is a more or less U.S. mafia. Maybe that's how it works on our. Anyway, when he got out of the army, and that bad discharge, gentleman discharge, he went in Chicago and hooked up some of his old army buddies. That's when he becomes concerned about that general discharge, because of he tried to join the CIA and the FBI, and excuse me. So he wound up going to private detective school for a while, but he didn't like it. He went out on surveillance with his FBI Federation undercover at that time. And now this was between, when he lived in Scotland, between 49 and 52, part of 52. Well, at that time, the communist, Joseph McCarthy committee was going on this communist secure. The FBI was doing, and CIA all on that, checking that stuff out. So he went on a couple of surveillance deals with his Federation. One of them was the Christian church, ran by communists, that set up next to the USO working information, recruit, which was a good idea. It was on State Street, he said, right off of Madison, in the Loop. And so in another surveillance deal he went on, which it was a Jewish communist, the FBI was checking out where the communists are. And it was in a tavern. It's run by a Jewish guy named Max Murray. And he had a tavern called Up on 9. It means to get up at Cameron 10 because he was ex-prize fighter. And
I don't think that you should believe everything a witness says, but I want to show you that there is documentary evidence to back up what John Larry Ray is saying, that his brother joined the CIA when he was in the Army. The CIA would have been just a few months old at the time. James Earl Ray's Army file does not exist anymore. It was burned up in a massive fire in St. Louis in the early 70s. It was lost also by the Illinois prison system, and the FBI also lost their copy. But this is author George Mcmillin's copy of James Earl's, the official record of James Earl's service. And it documents unusual occurrences along the lines of what James's brother John is saying in the DVD. One of the things that he says is that when James joined the CIA, his Army serial number changed. Now, Army serial numbers haven't been around for 41 years now. But when they did exist, they didn't change. They were constant. There would be no reason to change an Army serial number. Here is James Earl Ray's, I guess you could say, official Army serial number, 16163129. There is, if you look at this, and our mutual friend T helped me out on this. If you look at this, there's only one thing that strikes people as unusual that are familiar with the United States Army, and that's right here. That in April of 1948, James Earl Ray joined the 78 92nd Infantry Regiment. An Army expert that from the National Archives that I consulted, who has looked at Army records for 40 years, who says that he is familiar with records from the Revolutionary War right up until today, said that this was the only 4-digit Army unit that he had ever seen in all of that time. And someone who was in this unit who actually ended up spending his entire life in Intel said in an email to me that the 4-digit Army units were known as cover for Intel units.
What's that say right there? He's admitted, the very next sentence there. He is something.
Oh, this sentence here?
No, up higher. There, he is.
He got a victory,
Oh.
a medal for World War II. He wasn't even in the service at the end of World War II. I think everybody got that particular medal. Notice until April of 1948, he is supposedly in the 382nd Military Police Battalion. Well, I of course, went immediately to the records of the 7892nd Infantry Regiment and started pouring through the records of the 7892nd Infantry Regiment, and at first everything looked in order. Here is James Earl Ray being transferred from that military police battalion into the 7892nd in April of 1948. And then I kept looking and looking and looking at these documents and came across a parallel transfer, one sheet of paper, very out of position by its date, that was left later on in the file. And this is a transfer into the 7892nd Infantry Regiment, but not from the unit that his official record says that he was in, from another 4-digit unit, the 7838th Reserve Vehicle Detachment. And lo and behold, in this kind of slip-up document, this odd document, the parallel Army serial number that is described by John Larry Ray in the video is his Army serial number here, 16242515. So indeed, James Earl Ray is the only person I've ever heard of or could ever verify as having 2 separate Army serial numbers. And when is the earliest sign that we can find of him having 2 Army serial numbers? I went back and I had a friend order this Reserve Vehicle Detachment records, and this is a unit that he theoretically was not in, according to his official transcript of his records. And James Earl Ray, right here, gets the new Army serial number described by John Larry Ray in spring of 1948. He gets this number that is nobody's supposed to find it, but apparently it existed when he's in a unit which is one of these odd 4-digit units that he supposedly was not in. And if you go through the Merkin file, the Murder of King file, and you look for any reference to James Earl Ray's Army serial number, and it took me a while to figure this out, but you'll notice that these records from the crime in 1968, this is just one of several examples. They went back and whited out on several of them, especially the larger documents that they apparently did not want to retype. They went back and just whited out the new serial number that he was given, and then retyped in the official Army serial number. Now,
Got an honorable discharge.
he got a general discharge.
Is that honorable?
She's talking about
It's on the last sheet. It's gonna be the honorable discharge.
You got a general discharge, I don't know where that is.
It's on the very last sheet. It's on honorable.
You got a general discharge 2 days before his service was supposed to be up.
Go up one more sheet, I think. Is there one more sheet?
Yeah, they kicked him out 2 days before, which actually years later hurt his chance of medical care when he got hepatitis C. Now, John Larry Ray is adamant about the fact that his brother would say to him, he's talked quite a bit about this case to me, even beyond the DVD, but he's been adamant about the fact that his brother said to him when they were in Shelby County Jail together in 1974 that the King assassination goes all the way back to the shooting of Washington, this African-American soldier. And John would say he did it, he didn't want to do it, he felt horrible about it afterwards, and it's something that plagued him probably until the day that he died. Now, there is a history. I've actually spoken to two of the hypnotists that James Earl saw and dealt with. Two of the hypnotists are shrinks, but I believe that what John is describing is an early mind control program, and that James did not want to shoot this black soldier who was considered to be kind of a challenge, I understand, to the United States Army. Or at least that's the story they came up with. And although his Army file is no more, we do have author George Mcmillin's notes from James Earl's Army file. And remember I said the Illinois prison system had it? Well, when Mcmillin was speaking to Stowe Simon at the Illinois prison system, he made notes, and at the same time, March of 1948, that James Earl Ray's Army serial number changed. Actually, on the 25th of March 1948, James Earl Ray had a lumbar puncture, essentially a spinal tap. And this, they could administer drugs this way. He actually had, James Earl Ray had 2 spinal taps while he was in the Army. But this first one was the 25th of March 1948, while he was in this spook unit that is off of his official Army record. By the way, this is kind of interesting. Mcmillin is quoting Stowe Simon, and he writes, "Simon was here when Ray was here. The FBI almost lived here, tried to find out the people that he knew." So James Earl Ray had this lumbar puncture, and I've talked to doctors, and there are certain drugs that can be administered that way, and perhaps psychological drugs. And this was happening at the exact same month as the CIA, according to their MK Ultra file, the earliest documents in their MK Ultra file, that they were doing experimentation on soldiers within the United States Army, because there's Army terms related to it. James Earl Ray, according to the FBI, also quoting this file, James Earl tried to get out of the Army, and although it's not reflected, none of this is reflected in the morning reports of the units that he was in, James Earl James Earl went AWOL 4 times between the spring of '48 and when he was given his general discharge in December. James Earl was given a discharge in late '48, went back to his hometown, as John said, hung out in Chicago, and there is evidence. I don't have the means to take it to court, but there's quite a bit of evidence in FBI files that James Earl did indeed act as a mole for the FBI between 1949 and 1952 in Chicago. So, in 1949, James Earl Ray supposedly rides the rails out to Los Angeles, and this is where he is arrested for the first time. Coming back from the Army, James Earl Ray is a changed man. In 1948 documents, John Larry Ray tells the FBI that he was a normal person until he left the Army, and that he has been acting crazy ever since leaving the Army. His father and his uncle said that he must be on goofballs, but nobody ever saw him taking drugs. In 1949, he travels to Los Angeles, one of the capitals of drug experimentation by the government, and he's arrested. He says, "I must have drank too much," he wrote in Tennessee Waltz, the original version of his book. "I must have drank too much or somebody slipped me a goofball, because when I woke up in a cafeteria, the side office of the cafeteria, and a police officer was shaking me, and I just got out of there." There's a little discrepancy as to the time period, but within 4 days, James Earl is walking down the street, and the police officer and 2 witnesses all converge on him at the same time, and he is arrested for supposedly trying to steal a typewriter, and he has his first prison sentence, but was adamant about the fact that he felt as if he was drugged. At this same time, James Earl, he says that he had to ride the rails out to California, but his brother is adamant about the fact that he was getting money from the government, and that all he would have to do would be to make a call, and he would show up later with a reasonable sum of money. James Earl left California after serving a short sentence, went back to Chicago, apparently was used as a mole in a few undercover operations by the FBI, and it appears that he had contact in 1952 with this African-American soldier, Washington. I've never been able to identify him. With this African-American soldier named Washington. Now, there had been a court-martial trial, and as John said, the government took the word of the MP, James Earl Ray. But the court-martial trial ended up costing this soldier Washington his Army pension. In 52, they had been writing letters back and forth, letters that John Larry Ray had in his own hand, and James agreed to fill out an affidavit saying that he lied at this court-martial trial, and this shooting that John describes, which paralyzed Washington from the waist down, that he wanted to make sure that the court-martial, the effects of the court-martial trial were reversed, and he wanted to make sure that Washington got his pension. James said to John The Army screwed both of us, so Washington should end up at least getting his pension. At approximately the time that James agreed to help Washington, he was arrested in the robbery of a taxi in Chicago, a red top taxi. There are different various versions of what happened. Possibly it was meant to be a shooting to death of James Earl Ray. But there appear to be some mind control aspects to this 1952 arrest. It came at an extremely convenient time for the government, in that it allowed the government to have leverage against James Earl, and James Earl agreed that, according to his brother John, if the government lessened his sentence, and it appears that the gun went away, that it was an armed robbery and that the gun went away, he would forget about helping Washington, and that the CIA told James Earl in Cook County Jail that if they helped him, he had to forget about doing anything for this African American soldier, Washington, and indeed he, I'm sorry to say, did so. The statement, by the way, James Earl has been pretty forthcoming about his criminal past, and the statement about his arrest is peculiar, and he has never said who put him up to the robbery, other than there was someone else involved. This is his statement on the 52 arrest. I think I need to borrow someone's reading glasses. I just got arrested for robbery. I was to have stopped a taxi driver, taken $11. Thank you.
No, thank you, Tim. Try.
I was to have stopped a taxi driver, taken $11, and driven off with the cab. I was arrested in the cab after the officers fired a warning shot and wounded me in both arms. I admitted the robbery, but without a pistol. I was arrested May 6th and pleaded guilty on June 4th, and for this got a 1 to 2 year sentence. So I don't think that I'm making too much of the fact that this came at a very opportune time for the government. They said something to James Earl, such as, "We don't want this scab opened up again," and it allowed the Washington case to be forgotten about. James Earl Ray served 2 years in the Illinois State Prison and was arrested in 1955 in what was honestly probably a criminal activity. He was released from prison in 1958 and engaged in criminal activities. None of them were very brazen, and none of them was violent. In 1959, because of the heat supposedly coming down on him for these criminal activities, James Earl Ray left the St. Louis area and decided to hang out in a place that wasn't so hot, and he chose Montreal. Now, you would think that if you're going to take off from St. Louis and head to someplace that wasn't very hot, you might go to Chicago or Kansas City or maybe Minneapolis, where I'm from. Toronto certainly would be closer if you wanted to go to Canada, but Montreal is where he went, and stayed within the vicinity of McGill University, where Ewan Cameron ran sub-project 68 of the MK Ultra mind control sub-project. I wouldn't make very much of his taking off to Montreal, except that Jules Kimball, who Jim Garrison thought was an excellent witness, said that 8 years later, he and James Earl were up in Montreal being programmed at McGill University. So it's certainly an oddity that he would choose Montreal, a city which was so far away and which would have a future history for him. In 1959, James Earl was arrested again, but shortly after returning from Montreal, his crimes were very different and very, very brazen. In the late 50s, he conducted several break-ins at night, usually. Usually very, very safe robberies. The grocery store robberies that he conducted in 1959 with Blackie Austin and Jimmy Owens were very different. He seemed to be a changed person coming back from Montreal, running into grocery stores filled with people, waving a gun in the air, threatening people. If you had ever met the man, you couldn't imagine him doing it, but he did. And it leads me to think that there may have been some type of at least psychological response to what had gone on in Montreal. His brother, John, and his brother John is clear about the fact that when James Earl Ray was arrested for this final robbery that he committed of a Kroger grocery store, that there was a government man there, an agent, that the local police got their wires crossed on who the crook was, and actually beat the government agent before he flashed some type of identification, and the police told him to get out of there. Oddly, James felt that he was actually innocent, even though he robbed it and he admitted robbing it, and this Kroger grocery store and grocery stores before this. He claimed that because this man was there, he was actually innocent of the crime, which leads me to think that there was that indeed perhaps it could have been a psychological test. And John said that James tried to, for several years, locate this man. From 1959 until his escape, on April 23rd, 1967, James Earl Ray was in the Missouri State Prison at Jeff City, and I am not the only one. There are many people going back now 35 years that believe that the Missouri State Prison was one of the currently unknown MK Ultra mind control projects. Freedom magazine made that allegation for the first time in 1973, and it has been mentioned several times since. In 1966, James Earl Ray attempted to escape prison. It was unsuccessful. His attorney, a man named Quigley, suggested an insanity plea. To be examined for the insanity plea, James Earl Ray was transferred to the State Hospital number 1, the mental institution in Fulton, Missouri. The man that ran the mental hospital in Fulton was a man by the name of Donald Bullens Peterson. Donald Bullens Peterson had been chief of psychiatry during the Korean War for the United States Army, and between 1954 and 1956, when he supposedly retired, was the United States Army chief of psychiatry. He is a native of Minneapolis, like I am. When he left the Army in 1956, he went to Anoka, Minnesota to live for a couple of years. Garrison Keillor's from there. And apparently at the mental hospital at Anoka, Minnesota, he introduced Thorazine, a familiar drug to many of us, to the care of the patients in Anoka. He then was transferred to Fulton, where he became James Earl Ray's main confidant in 1966. And according to the file of James Earl Ray's time at Fulton, James trusted him, and James told him a very big secret that he wouldn't tell to anyone else. So while he was in Fulton, if you read James Earl's book, he saw people getting electroshock and flipping around like fish on tables, and saw people that had had massive amounts of Thorazine. They were sitting in rocking chairs, laughing at one another. So Fulton was certainly a house of horrors. By the way, Donald Peterson's wife's maiden name was, this is something I have to follow up on, but Donald Peterson's wife's maiden name was Quigley, the same name as the attorney that directed him to Fulton. James was considered to be, by the mental hospital at Fulton, a sane, mentally healthy person. He then demanded to speak to an outside shrink for a second opinion. And when he demanded to speak to an outside shrink, all charges against him in his unsuccessful escape were dropped. Interestingly, the people that were in charge of not just Fulton, but also the prison at Jeff City, the director of all of the prisons was a man by the name of Wilkinson, who had done highly classified work for the CIA, and the warden Swenson was also a federal man who was brought in after the death of Evie Nash, the previous warden, who supposedly committed suicide, but the family tells me that he committed suicide with the gun in the other room. That the gun wasn't even found in the same room as the body, and the family begged the FBI for a new investigation of Evie Nash's death. So James Earl was being considered shortly after this for parole. The doctor for the parole board was Dr. Henry V. Goulman Jr., Dr. Goulman said that James Earl wasn't ready for parole because he had severe psychological problems. Totally the opposite opinion of Dr. Peterson and his staff earlier. And Dr. Goulman put James on Librium, another MK Ultra drug. I was able to speak to Dr. Goulman. He was very sick with cancer the last time I called him, and he hung up on me. I spoke with him on the telephone 3 times. The second time was the longest. He was a little hostile. I only asked him psychological questions, and he said to me, "I suppose you've seen my psychological report on James Earl Ray." Just totally out of the blue, because I didn't mention James at all. And I pressed Dr. Goulman for a comment on behavior modification programs between Jefferson City and the State Hospital number 1 in Fulton. Dr. Goulman said to me, well, they'd come over from Fulton, and they'd come to the 5th floor hospital, the mental ward at Jeff City, and they'd say, we want this one, but we don't want this one, and we want this one, and they'd take them back over to Fulton, and that's the way they did it then. I taped it, so I've heard it several times. And I said, for what, Dr. Goulman? Therapy? And he chuckled and he said, well, presumably therapy. By the way, I've just been told by journalist C.D. Stelzer, he emailed me and said, I don't want to make you more paranoid, but I've found out that the man in charge of the 5th floor mental hospital at Jefferson City is a man by the name of Leroy Rook, who apparently doesn't seem to be a psychologist, but was a 1939 graduate from West Point. So there were Army shrinks all over Jefferson City and Fulton. It's pretty much common knowledge that if you look at any magazine from the period, that James Earl Ray, between his April 67 escape and the murder of Dr. King in April of 68, saw at least 2 hypnotists. The first one was a former Army counterintelligence officer named Mark O. Freeman. The second was a German-born person, Nazi-era person, by the name, supposedly, of Reverend Xavier von Koss. And Bud Fensterwald, who many of you know, interviewed von Koss. It was hard for him to track him down, but considered him to be a intelligence agency hypnotist. And I spoke with 85, both I think Goulman and Freeman were 85 when I spoke to them. I spoke to Freeman, who hopefully he's since died because I don't want to be sued, but I spoke with Freeman when he was 85, and he told me, he said, James Earl Ray told him, I don't like niggers, and that's government falsehood. As a matter of fact, James Earl's best friend when he was an older man in prison was an African American gentleman, and he told me that he was Army counterintelligence during Second World War, that he worked with the FBI after the war, and that very heavily through the 1950s, he said until it was made illegal in, I think, 67, he experimented with LSD at a time when the United States government was buying massive amounts of acid so that other entities couldn't get their hands on it. So apparently Dr. Freeman is also part of James Earl Ray's psychological manipulation, not to make him a shooter, but to make him an obedient patsy, and you could certainly say that he was that. Xavier von Koss was born around 1905, 1910. I can't get anything from the state of California about him. He almost doesn't seem to be a real person, and he appears to be this same type of manipulator of James Earl Ray. And obviously, shortly afterwards, James was successfully maneuvered to Memphis. One sad footnote to the King case that appears to have the stamp of behavior modification on it is the 1974 shooting of Alberta King. And this happened when James Earl was seeking a new trial, and there was a widely publicized evidentiary hearing in Memphis. And I spoke to one of the people that was there and spoke to the young man who shot Alberta King, Marcus Wayne Chenault from Dayton, Ohio, and he said absolutely that Alberta King was not the target, that it was really Coretta Scott King, and that he was asking, will Coretta Scott King be in the service today, and was told yes. So apparently there was a change of plan when she wasn't there. However, like James Earl Ray, like John Hinckley, like John Muhammad, there was a dramatic change in Marcus Wayne Chenault's behavior when he went off to college. He met a man sometimes known as Rabbi Israel. His real name was Stephen Holloman. If you want to issue a FOIA request, Stephen Holloman would be over 100 now. The effect of this Stephen Holloman on Marcus Wayne Chenault was apparently dramatic, and the cover story was that he was going to shoot all the black preachers, which supposedly these people didn't like. But at his trial and when he was arrested, he said, I suppose I shot somebody, but didn't remember shooting anyone. And like many of these other cases, there appears to be another shooter on the scene, and whether he even shot Alberta King is who knows. So, thanks for having me. Are there questions?
You done anything on the Hinckley case?
No, the King case has kept me so busy, and it branches out in so many directions. But John, did you say that Mark Lane is his attorney now? Hinckley's?
Well, recently he was trying to get him out of the mental institution and get him longer passes to be with the family. And
This is his attorney years ago. I talked to him about that.
You talked to Mark Lane about
I
that?
talked to Mark Lane about that years ago. He was the attorney for Hinckley.
Yeah.
They got him. He told me they had gotten him out of the part of the mental hospital where people scream all night, and got him into an area where he could at least sleep.
He was also trying to get him released.
Yeah.
On a regular basis.
Yes, Mark Lane is certainly where the action is.
Yeah, he's a history.
He was able to make it through the jungle in Jonestown when no one else could.
John.
This Linkover you're talking about is one that I studied, and Marcus Wayne Chenault and Rabbi Abram Israel, as he called himself, or sometimes Rabbi David Hill, he formed a colony in Guyana. And I can stand up and say it, but he was within about 25 miles of Matthews Ridge. He bragged that he had 8,000 black people in this colony. He and some of his followers were allowed into Jonestown right after the murder to take the shoes and the guns and anything valuable they could from the bodies of the dead. And he was also a mentor to another person named Donald DeFreeze, or Field Marshal Cinque of the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army, who was himself a police informant and operated and used by them and used by the Glass House in Los Angeles, police intelligence unit. He came out grinning with a gun in each hand, he said, from the church, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the Family Church for the Kings, and he said, "Did I hit anybody?" He told the NAACP, this is Marcus Wayne Chenault, that he had lists of people that he was supposed to kill.
They found the list on.
And that he was part of a group called the Troop or the Truth that Chenault was also part of up in Cleveland, Ohio. They had gun magazines and other things when they abandoned it. But this Rabbi Hill was able to leave the country, go to Guyana, set up a separate operation, worked with the Burnham government, helped them in elections and other things according to the news reports, and there was this crossover. Also, remember that Coretta Scott King is intended to target Mrs. Alberta King, who he actually shot, or perhaps not, because again, there were no ballistics, but someone shot, and he takes the credit for blame. And A.D. King, King's brother, were the only three eyewitnesses to the wounds on Dr. King at the morgue. And A.D. King died, strangely, at the family home in a pool in the back, dressed in a suit and tie, face down, just dead in the swimming pool, and supposedly drowned when he obviously wasn't swimming, fully dressed. And so, that's two of the three witnesses. Maybe Coretta was to be killed there, or maybe, it became too politically, after the mother was killed, like leaving Ted alone. Too hot to do the killing. But these were witnesses, and Dr. Francesca, who was the coroner, refused to cut Dr. King open or to follow the path of the bullet. You go to the House Select Committee, his testimony and testimony of the House Select Committee. The conclusions are, well, we couldn't determine the actual angle of the bullet, we couldn't determine the actual place, location of the assassin, but James already did. And it was a bullet that came in here and went through the cheek and down into the back, but it lifted Dr. King off the balcony, which a bullet from above would not have done. His feet left the balcony, according to the one eyewitness up parallel with him. And he was spun to the right, which would also the bathroom window, which is not a possible shot anyway, but is off to the left, and would have driven him to the left if it had hit him from that side. Much more consistent with right across the street, across Mulberry and up on the ridge, which has now been destroyed. But so even seeing those wounds or being able to describe them, and it's also interesting that a few months later in June, when Robert Kennedy is shot, a call goes out from the government and the LAPD in Los Angeles to who? Dr. Francesca, who also covered up the Elvis Presley death, to come to Los Angeles and to work on the Robert Kennedy autopsy. And so they have certain people that they move along in these operations, the psychiatrists and psychologists that you're studying, they often cross over, and the same people. Hinckley had a double named Mark Richardson. They both went to a doctor in Colorado, Dr. Rappaport. He says he gave Hinckley biofeedback by putting leads in his head, electronic leads in his head, and the parents sent him there just before he came down to Washington to do the shooting. But the double, who came after him and was going to finish the job, got an apartment at Yale, wrote his own love letters to Jodie Foster 2 weeks later, came down on a bus and was picked up at the Port Authority because he had a gun in his luggage. Anybody been to the New York Port Authority?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no metal detector, there's nothing. There's thousands of people going a million ways. How on earth, if you didn't know who he was, would you have stopped him? And he praised the SLA, Richardson, and he praised Squeaky Fromm, and he was, he was locked up in a mental institution. He was in Evergreen. He had ties to World Vision, as Hinckley and his father did, and he came like Team B, Hinckley, he said, I'm going to finish the job. But he went to a particular psychiatrist, or certain psychiatrists that brought in to interview these people, or they have ties back to the MK Ultra programming histories.
I thought the doctor's name was Dr. Hopper. You mentioned a Dr. Rappaport
Dr.
of
Rappaport,
Evergreen, Colorado.
yes.
So Hinckley went to more than one
Yes, he did
psychiatrist
see more than
in
one.
Evergreen, Colorado.
Mhm. It's also interesting to me that Hinckley is not taken after an attempt on the president to a federal prison facility or a DC facility. He's taken to Quantico Marine Base. Timothy McVeigh is locked up in a Marine base. This is not legal procedure. This is debriefing operations, and certain psychiatrists are brought in then to see them and to debrief them and to get them to forget or whatever it is. But this programmed assassin, grinning, did I hit anybody? I did what I had to do is a common phrase, not having a memory of what they've done, and being part of operations that spill over into other operations and crossover is a lot of the history that I've found working on these cases. But
You're in D.C. Have you thought about trying to go see Hinckley?
yes,
See what
and
he said?
the city paper, somebody got someone up into there, and my friend Lenny Lappin called Hinckley once, and he sent Hinckley his article, Who Shot R.R., and Hinckley said he wished he knew what happened that day, and he's never been clear. So it's like Sirhan and the others, and then he sent him a copy of, my friend Lenny sent him a copy of his book about psychiatry, but it's also about mind control and other aspects.
But is Hinckley clear about what happened at the military base where he was debriefed?
That I don't know. I mean, I would like to sit there. There was a bench he used to sit down on. I tried to find it one time, but I couldn't locate him. But a city paper guy wrote an article about him sitting out there. So I would like to talk to Arthur Bremer. He's just been released. And then recently they released Sarah Jane Moore, who took the shot at Gerald Ford. And there were so many releases recently, I said it must be election season.
David Bremer, I called David Bremer the brother of Arthur Bremer one time, and it's not easy talking to him.
Yeah.
You just leave my family alone.
Well, when one of the things I found interesting about David Berkowitz, who was also put in a cell, like Patty Hearst is put in the cell next to Sarah Jane Moore. This guy's put in the cell next to the guy that shot Lennon. And this is the guy they called Son of Sam, but Mae Russell called him Son of Uncle Sam. And the reason she called him that was that I got an article right away in the Philadelphia Inquirer, his best friend in his army unit in Korea, of David Berkowitz, this mass killer supposedly, who was talked to by a black dog that told him what to do, named Sam. He says, oh, I knew Dave Berkowitz. He was in my army unit in Korea. He was a clerk in the unit. And he said, he applied as conscientious objector to get out of the military. And he said, and the brass gave him acid. The brass gave him acid? Do they give you acid, or do they give you acid derivatives, or do they give you MK Ultra? Here's a guy that tried to get out as a conscientious objector, and they programmed him into somebody that would be part of mass killings later on. And, so the real histories of these things, often if you go into them in any detail, you're going to find military intelligence around them, you're going to find programming, psychological manipulation, and patsies, over and over again, these same methods, because they work.
Sloppy operations, and let the press cover up for it afterwards.
Gawler's Funeral Home that Walt mentioned. I was here for an ASK conference years ago, and over at the, or no, was it ASK, I think? Yeah, I guess it was ASK, but there was a young Navy intern who was working on Kennedy's head at Bethesda, and some years ago. He's the one that got the photographs released. I'm not remembering his name right now, but he was
Paul O'Connor.
Paul O'Connor.
Yeah.
And I was talking to him, and he was telling the story about a lot of interesting pieces to his story, including the fact that there were 60 people there in a teaching morgue watching it, when we thought nobody had even seen it. But he said that he was very impressed when Gawler's came in to prepare Kennedy, because he had worked at funeral homes, and how professional they were, and that even though rigor had set in, he got Kennedy completely dressed in a three-piece suit without cutting the back of the clothes that they normally do, and plastering his head, and he was just very impressed with them. And he said then they were, an old funeral home, and they'd been around for 150 years. And I said, they didn't do Lincoln, did they? And he said, oh yes, they did Lincoln. And I said, if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. And then I met Gawler's daughter on the street one time just by chance, and I said, played dumb. I said, "Oh, you're from that funeral home." I said, "You did Kennedy, didn't you? Your father did Kennedy?" "Oh, yes, yes. Done lots of famous people." I said, "Really? Who else?" He said, "Oh, we did Howard Hughes." I said, "Howard Hughes?" I said, "Don't they have any undertakers in Texas?" But Howard Hughes, again, was a case of a fake death where the IRS wanted the real Hughes to appear, and so you have an instant dead Hughes, and they're the ones that fix them up. So I found lawyers and psychiatrists and undertakers and coroners that just keep doing the job over and over and over again in this case.
Maybe we can get a shot of these last documents, because I've been I just want to document, as well as I can, this psychological nature to the case. This I found in George Mcmillin's papers. It is government author George Mcmillin writing Mendel Rivers, the congressman, trying to get the Army to release James Earl's file, which hadn't been burned up yet. And they wouldn't release it. I didn't underline this. Mcmillin did. They say that they aren't going to release it, and this is particularly true since there are medical aspects involved which could not be disassociated from any discussion of Mr. Ray's military background. This slipped through in the FBI's Merkin file. By the way, because I bugged the FBI so much and drove them so crazy, made them pushed them to put the Merkin file on a CD-ROM. They got sick of me, so they gave it to the National Archives, and the Weisberg release of the headquarters file and the 8 main field office file was originally, what was released to Herald in '77 was 40,000 pages. It's now 80,000 pages. They withheld half of it. So there may be some interesting things in there. The autopsy photos are in there, and I wanted to see it, and they said I would have to come up with a good reason for looking at the autopsy photos. So I think I have that. This is just routine investigation of James Earl Ray's life. His claim number at the VA is 7661340. So I took that out to the VA without mentioning James's name, or eventually I think I said Jim Ray. And their response when I said that number was, "Who's this guy? Military intelligence?" And I said, "Well, I think so." This number that starts with 7 is a special number that the person that so they call it a sensitive 7. The person that I spoke to at the VA said that they didn't have a high enough security to look beyond the first screen at any other screens relating to the person with that number. So the James Earl Ray was not just some dupe.
You had copies of your book, did you bring?
Mm-mm. No, sorry.
And you might have.
When he was in prison, this is Stowe Simon, the prison psychiatrist from the 52 to 54 Illinois prison sentence. He writes, "He seems to have been highly unsettled after leaving the Army, and we would judge that some traumatic experience occurred which he does not care to tell or cannot verbalize. He seems to be rather solitary and unhappy, and there have been at least 2 instances of poorly thought out or delinquent behavior connected with drinking. He never touched a drop until he went into the Army, and this last you've seen. This is typical of, it seems like if it's a shorter document, they will just retype it if it has his Army serial number in it. If it's a longer one, there's a whiteout on the page, and they'll just retype it over sometimes with a typewriter that doesn't appear to match. Thank you for your reading glasses. I guess I don't know how old I'm getting.
I did have a question.
Yes.
On that document that has James Earl Ray's listed with a unit, have you
Yeah.
ever checked into any of the other names on that unit to see?
I've called and spoken with a number of people that were in both. There were these. There appear. Now this is supposition, but it appears as if. I know that James Earl Ray was given a psychological test by the Army called an alpha test. And I know that in the early 70s he tried through the courts to actually get that test. When there appears to be something larger going on, like people ended up in the 78 92nd Infantry Regiment if they passed a certain type of test. And a lot of the units that they came from were these unusual 4-digit units. I have spoken to people that were in the 78 92nd Infantry Regiment, and they, at least in some of the companies, they believed that nothing unusual was going on. I have only been able to interview one person that was in Company B, and he was very, I don't know what I would say, rural and not much help, and he probably would have missed it unless something just totally hit him right in the face. More importantly, if you try to look into these people, and I have a file cabinet of as many records relating to these people as I can possibly get my hands on. The ranks of at least the 78 92nd Infantry Regiment that existed, by the way, for only 2 months. They put together supposedly 2,000 people for 2 months, and most of those people were later transferred into the 16th Infantry Regiment, which is where James Earl Ray's official, he was supposedly drunk in quarters and took off to Nuremberg. He also had, by the way, a spinal tap before he was supposedly drunk in quarters, according to George Mcmillin's records, in the fall of '48. So it's odd that he had the spinal tap and then was supposedly drunk in records. But the most important thing about these people is, of the people that that were in the morning reports from these units, that I would call up and I'd say, you know, I have you in this unit. They'd say, nope, that's not me. And they'd be unusual names. Obviously, I'd have to shoot for the unusual names. And then I'd say, well, wait a minute now, was your Army serial number da-da-da-da-da-da? And they'd say, yep, that's me. I said, you were in the Army in Germany in April, May, and June of '48. They'd say, no, I was back home with a bad back. Really? And that was repeated. And I did speak to for the people that know T, Marty, her friend, if you know Marty Bragg, hooked me up with a guy who had been in military intelligence, and it was interesting. One of the first things that he said to me was, if this unit is what you think it is, many of the people that are in the ranks will not actually have been there. So they wouldn't want to put apparently they wouldn't want to put 2,000 people together into a unit to supposedly see something that they aren't supposed to see. That it was much smaller. And there's a photographic record of it. Oddly, apparently the Army, it doesn't say who published it, but there was a book that the New York Public Library has right now called Redesignation Day. It is a book commemorating the 7892nd Infantry Regiment being redesignated into, most of the soldiers, being redesignated into the 16th Infantry Regiment. The Army wrote a book about this unit that only existed for 2 months. Now, tell me that isn't peculiar.
Yeah.
It's peculiar.
The title of your book is Truth at Last.
Truth at Last.
So, I mean, what is the final conclusion? I mean, we see maybe some records that have been altered. We see some medical records that indicate it put us kind of on a direction of this. But do you have a conclusion that really goes beyond what you're talking about here?
Well, it deals with much of the case going from the 1940s onward. I mean, I suppose you mean, what about that day in Dallas? And we don't spend much time on that because well,
I don't mean Dallas, but I'm talking
or in Memphis, rather, I meant to say. James Earl Ray was innocent.
Okay.
And the shooter he believed that it was Raul. Whether it was Raul or not, I don't know. But I hooked James up with a literary agent, and the literary agent spoke with him before he died, and the literary agent said to him, I need to Brian Richard Boylan was his name, he was a big author in the 60s, and he said, I need to know who was the shooter, and James said, no problem whatsoever. We were going to try to get him out one last time and tell a real book, and he acknowledged essentially to Brian that he couldn't say while he is in prison everything that he needs to say, that he wants to say it at trial, and that he wants to get out. And this is one of the things that Reverend Lawson, James Lawson, said to me when I first called him also. I can't tell everything I know in here. And John said James was very, very concerned about being identified as a government operative in prison, that he would be considered a snitch by the other prisoners, and that was actually his biggest fear, that he didn't think he'd survive it.
Some of this is sounding like the story Jack Ruby gave, where he could not give the information in Dallas, so he had to go to Washington, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we've learned since then that he did talk in Dallas. But how much time did you spend totally with James Earl Ray?
Well, I spoke with him on the phone. I met him in prison one time. We wrote to one another quite a bit.
Okay.
I think the last piece of mail that he ever sent out was to me.
I think somebody needs to have the same kind of contact with Hinckley.
And Chapman and the interesting character, I think, is John Muhammad, because he actually told a friend of his that he was a part of a military intelligence operation. I heard that on the evening news, and he stood up at his trial and said that he couldn't be responsible for this. And it isn't as if he is somebody who has not been a part of the establishment. I think if I'm not mistaken, Muhammad was in the reserves going back to 77 or 78, and then was in the Army, I think, through the 90s. So, interestingly, in summer of 1948, James Earl was on maneuvers in Grafenwohr, Germany, and that's where John Muhammad was stationed too. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
About Dallas too. Of course, the big one is Sirhan, and I guess last we heard he's been put off into solitary confinement after 9/11, in spite of exemplary conduct in jail. So,
Sirhan's lawyer, Larry Teeter, former lawyer, took very seriously what John Larry Ray said in my research, and asked me to put together a file because it could be evidence in Sirhan's case. And I had John write a letter, and I put together a packet, and I sent it out in the mail. And I heard that Larry had died of cancer, like Mrs. King. I got that package back with the what I believe was correct address scribbled out, and I think I got it back 4 months later, 5 months later.
This is about the
So,
time that Teeter died.
Larry Teeter was dead by the time I got the package back.
Okay, well, I don't see a whole lot, I don't see surprises about that. Teeter was here a number of times.
Yeah.
Two things. Since we just mentioned Larry Teeter, people need to know, it might be just a simple coincidence. Teeter died in Tijuana, Mexico,
Uh-huh.
and so did Greta Scott King.
Yeah. I know they were both in Mexico.
Apparently, I think they were both in Tijuana. Someone needs to check a little bit further into that.
Is that where Phil Melanson was too?
I don't know if he got treatment. He also, unfortunately, died of cancer. But
Yeah.
did you ever talk to Ray extensively about Raul, to reveal more about Raul? He wouldn't, would he?
I didn't want to bug him about stuff. You know, my relationship with him was more somebody friendly. I just felt bad for him, honestly.
And his testimony at the House Select Committee on Assassination is the only time he was out of prison?
Well, he was transferred back and forth, you know, to Shelby County Jail and whatnot over the years. But it's interesting that he was beaten up the night before he testified to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He writes about it in. If you want to buy James Earl's book, get Tennessee Waltz, which is the original version of the book. Don't get Who Killed Martin Luther King, because there are odd key things removed from the second version. For instance, it's presented as a very benign thing. Donald Bowens Peterson, D.B. Peterson, being the head shrink at Fulton, but Donald Peterson's name is removed from Who Killed Martin Luther King, along with what I think are some other kind of key pieces of evidence. Just removed, like you set them side by side and they read almost the same, except for that.
This sensitive sin thing reminded me of a case that I worked on, tried to do some background in a very horrible situation in Philadelphia where a guy was meeting at a McDonald's near a home for retarded women, young retarded women, and then taking them back to his house, chaining them in the basement, using them sexually, and also cannibalizing them. And this went over a period of years. And then finally the story broke when one of the women managed to get out of the basement, and it took her 4 to 6 hours to get the police to even take her serious enough to go investigate. He had been investigated by them several times before. It turned out neighbors had complained of smells from the house and other things, and they never went in, they never looked around. It was like they had some kind of a cover on this. He had a sign on the front of the porch, they said in the articles, that said People's Temple. And he was on 100% psychiatric disability from the U.S. Army, which I found, and his brother was too, which I found interesting because it's not usually on 100% you're living off the grounds of the VA psych hospital. He was said to be a genius that had figured out the stock market so that with a $50 investment he had gotten $50 million in the bank in his Merrill Lynch account. But here he was driving this old Cadillac around, living in a dilapidated house and all this filth, abusing these women. And when he got arrested, I called his lawyers listed, and I said, look, I have some suspicion that this guy is bad at things that he's done, that he may be, because they gave some background on his military stuff, and he had been in many of these cities in Germany where the MK Ultra was done in the different years, that he may be an experimental victim of them and programmed or messed up in some tie all the way back then. So he took me seriously enough that he went to the VA But he called me and he said that when they put in the number, red flashing screen came up and said, access denied, top security, so.
It'll begin with 7 to 11, depending on the
I didn't ask him
level.
for the number at the time, but.
Well, thank you. I'm actually, this is the last time I will speak on this case. I am a family man, and I've been harassed 4 times that I know of, seemingly by government operatives, and I'm getting out of it. So thank you. Well, John saw one of the times, barely, but we were staying over at the other hotel, the Lawrence.
Yeah.
And John and I spoke. I think John Judge is one of the finest men who's ever lived, and moreover, I think that he's one of the smartest people I've ever met, and that he's right about everything.
I had to pay him quite a bit.
Wow.
And there isn't much of that. And he isn't afraid, and I am, and I admire him for not being afraid. But we spoke until about 5 in the morning, and I think we were on the 2nd floor where the meeting halls are, and our elevator went up to, I think, the 7th floor I was staying on. And when you just saw him barely, but I walked off, and there was a guy standing there with a pencil-lined mustache, mirrored aviator sunglasses, a goofy jacket, goofy-looking tie. I mean, so that if I described his appearance, I'd sound like a nutcase, And he chased me down to my room and then turned around and walked the other way. But he was waiting on that floor for me. And I don't want to go into all of the stuff, I guess, but they came up to me in Atlanta, the feds did, and spoke, told me back to me the stuff that my wife and I had said over the phone to let me know that that they had been listening to the phone calls. So as someone with little children, I'm done.
Did you just drive 13 hours and you're going to get back on the road and drive 13 hours?
I'm happy to be here for you. Probably the last time, but I'm happy to be here for you. Thank you.